Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the start of a new week. And hope this finds you all well. And trust the signal of the stream is getting out there. Do the normal routine, by the way, which before we kick off and we introduce our special Monday night guest. Want you to do the usual. So if you like, if you're watching this on Facebook, share and like it. If you're on YouTube, share, subscribe. Make sure you have the notification bell pressed, because the naughty folks sometimes unfollow us. If you want to follow my other social media channels, they're all down below. You can find them in the description box below. Very important this. If you enjoy the next 60 minutes, give us a thumbs up, please. Thumbs up. This is your job. I'm talking right at you now. Thumbs up if you like it. And if you don't like it, I really don't know why we have the thumbs down. Everybody likes it, right? And then last but not least, a couple of quickies. Go to altnewsmedia.net/subscribe and drop £1 in the hat if you want. That's one way to keep alternative channels like this going. So if you do that, and then the other thing to say is, of course, that get your message noticed with a super chat, so you can hit those. Now, there's loads of stuff we could have talked about tonight. We could have talked about Nicola Sturgeon getting. Oh, what a surprise! Did you see that Nicola was found not to have misled or done anything naughty at all? That came as such a shock to me, that one. And I was also equally surprised, by the way, when Boris Johnson told us that the third wave might be coming our way and there might be consequences for that. Never seen that one coming as well. But anyway, those are stories I decided not to talk about. And instead, what we're going to talk about is I'm going to bring our guest on now. We're going to talk about what I consider the absolute state of British policing and in some ways the British judiciary and of course British politics. So those are tonight's topics framed around some of the events that you and I have seen in the past couple of weeks in particular. So anyway, without further ado, drum roll, let me bring on Jon Holbrook. Welcome to the stream, Jon.
Hello, David. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back, Jon. We were talking just before we came on air. In my mind, it only seems like yesterday since you were on the stream, but so much happens in this fast-moving political world, and gosh, it's hard to keep up. But it's very good to see you, and it's great to have you back with us, Jon. A lot of people really enjoyed your last appearance on this one, so we're looking forward to your thoughts tonight. So, and thanks, I see you all joining. That's fine. Thanks everyone. Hello to you all. Jon, what I wanted to talk about, I did sum it up there. What I consider the absolute state of British policing, which is a sort of Twitterish way of saying what's just going on. And obviously, Jon, to set this conversation up, I wanted to start with the events in Bristol at the weekend. Now, because this is YouTube and Facebook, we can't show videos because that would cause hurty feelings. But there's a couple of things, things I just want to throw up, a few images just to set the scene, Jon. So if we can have the first one, please. Oh yeah, do you remember this one from a year ago? Why Bristol police can take the knee in Black Lives Matter protest? That was June 2020. You remember that? What happened since then? Next slide, please. Bristol should be proud. Oh, you can't make this up, Jon. Bristol should be proud over the destruction of the Colston statue, says the police chief. So that was interesting. And then more to the point, and this is what we all saw happening on, I think it was Saturday night. Yeah, I mean, these absolutely terrible images of wanton violence, Jon, and thuggery and attempted arson. And, terrible things to have to witness in the same city where, further images like this. I just unbelievable. Okay, let's take the images away. Bring Jon back and myself back up. Jon, what did you think of what we saw down in Bristol there the other night?
Well, those images are awful, aren't they? And, if ever there was a picture that painted 1,000 words, it's those pictures, really.
Yeah.
Because I think we all woke up this morning to see those pictures and were shocked. This is Bristol. This is in Britain, where there has been considerable lawlessness, wanton violence and vandalism, police officers hurt, The police station seems to be in the centre of the target, and police vehicles have been burning. So, you know, on a small scale, the rule of law broke down in Bristol last night, and that really ought to trouble us all. But my instinctive response on seeing those pictures, and I started to see them last night, was just as you've done, David, to be reminded of what the Bristol police chiefs did in the summer. And my instinctive response, which I tweeted out last night, was that you essentially reap what you sow. And I think the pulling down of the Colston statue in, I think it was June, wasn't it, by the BLM protesters, that was one of the most troubling incidents that I think I observed last year, because it wasn't just that the statue came down, it was the attitude of the police that I think caused a number of us to be very concerned, because the chief police officer said, and your clipping has just confirmed this, the police officer said, look, we understand why this statue needed to come down. We understand how certain sections of this community feel, and we stood by to let it happen. Now, I know they said that they stood by to avoid further aggravation, but that simply isn't good enough for the police force. If we don't have a police force that can police the streets and keep law and order, then heaven help us. And, you know, it got worse, didn't it? Because then we learned that very same chief officer in Bristol gets rewarded with a gong in the New Year's honours list. So, you know, what is our political class telling us? It's essentially telling us that they have lost the ability to govern. And when you show weakness, like they have shown, particularly in Bristol for so many months, I'm afraid that incidents like that are the result.
One of the things, John, as well, putting it in context, so that happened in Bristol, as you say, yesterday, but the day before in London, we had a kind of an anti-lockdown demonstration, which I think I'm sure you probably saw as well, which was pretty well attended, I think, you know, and it seemed to me to be pretty much peaceful. But I saw images, John, on, I'm not sure, one of the parks, it might have been Hyde Park, some park in London, where we seen, you know, burly police officers getting stuck in to a young man or a couple of young people who just, I don't know, I wasn't aware of anything that they'd done particularly, but they were being kicked as they lay on the ground. And, you know, what does, I mean, again, this is all bad. John, you spent your life, you know, in the law. You're a man of the law. And I've spent a lot of my time as well supporting the rule of law because of the events here in Northern Ireland. So it's very troubling to watch these scenes, like what happened on Saturday in London, to watch that and to see a police force which is acting in a way which seems very uncharacteristic of what we would have, I think, seen as the best of British policing. It's the worst of British policing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you, David. And I think what we've noticed, particularly over the last year, in fact, probably over the last 18 months, is that there are double standards going on so far as our police force is concerned. Because generally speaking, I think the anti-lockdown protests have been heavily policed. Yeah. And you only have to contrast that, particularly in the summer when the BLM protests were happening in breach of all the coronavirus regulations. I mean, I didn't personally have an issue with that, but what I did have an issue with was the way that they were allowed to happen and were lightly policed, even when they turned quite violent. Whereas the coronavirus, the anti-lockdown protesters have tended to be very heavily policed. And of course, we know that Piers Corbyn, when he organised one of these demonstrations, was fined £10,000. Yeah. As far as I know, I don't think anyone who's organised any of these Black Lives Matter protests has been fined. And then I think the reason I say go back over 18 months is you only have to go back to the Extinction Rebellion protests that were taking place at the end of 2019 before COVID hit, and which then started up again last year. And, you know, they caused considerable inconvenience and disruption.
Yeah.
I remember in particular there was one morning, wasn't there, when a lot of the national newspapers couldn't get their newspapers out because they'd been blockaded by Extinction Rebellion protesters, and yet the police, on the whole, tended to just stand aside and almost protect them.
Yeah.
These are not just ordinary demonstrations where people are expressing a point of view. These were protests which were intended to cause, their sole purpose was really to cause inconvenience, not just to newspapers, but to the working community and residents as a whole. And I experienced this many times myself when I was trying to cycle into work over Waterloo Bridge, and it was very difficult because of all the protests, and it went on for days, day after day, and yet on the whole the police policed them exceedingly lightly.
They did. I mean, the other thing about the way the police demonstrations is, we saw it, John, in the aftermath of, well, following the murder of the lady in London there about a week and a bit ago.
Yeah, Sarah Everard.
Yeah, Sarah Everard. Thank you, John. Following her murder, there were two particular rallies. There was one on Clapham Common, which was policed in pretty, probably quite robustly, but it was in sync with COVID regs. That was on one night, and then the next day they had a rally out in Parliament Green, and that was okay. So, to me, John, this raises fundamental questions about the degrees of latitude which seem to be directed by those at the top, because I don't think we can't always blame the officers. We shouldn't necessarily, they're following orders, to borrow a phrase. But what the amount of latitude seemed to be incredible. How can it be that one night a vigil for Sarah Everard is deemed just beyond the pale, and the next day, yeah, it's fine, it's no problem? How can that be?
Yeah, well, how can it? I mean, if we're all going to have confidence that the law is to applied equally, then it has to be applied equally. And you can't have the police saying that we think that these demonstrations are okay, whereas a different sort of demonstration is not okay. And of course, what I think troubles a lot of people is the way in which the police force tend to be quite woke in their attitudes these days. So, that's why they've tended to be quite light on certainly the Black Lives Matter movement, and also on Extinction Rebellion, because they tend to be much more middle class movements, if you like. Whereas I think a lot of more ordinary people have tended to take part in the anti-lockdown protests. So you can't. People quickly lose faith in the police. If they are seen to be taking sides, and I think that should really trouble us all, because if we're going to have faith in the police, which we clearly need to do as a society to maintain law and order, then they have to be seen to be treating all of us equally, no matter what political demonstrations we go on. And again, you see, I think it's worse because the anti-lockdown protests have really just been traditional demonstrations where people are saying, look, we do not agree with this lockdown. And that's exactly what, in a democratic society, that's what people should be allowed to do. Whereas when you get to the Extinction Rebellion protests, they are of a different kind, aren't they? Because they are not really about saying, look, we think this. Those protests are really about trying to force us to act and think in a certain way. They're very much about undermining democracy, if you like, by having a coercive impact, such as I mentioned earlier, the way they stop those newspapers being distributed. So that's what troubles me, because obviously the right to protest is an important part of our democracy, but it can quickly be abused if it is used to undermine our democracy, which it is when people are using protest in a coercive way.
Yeah, so John, apologies for my abrupt departure from the stream. Even worse than the state of British policing is the state of rural broadband. Let me tell you,
Yeah.
that's
Don't worry, I kept talking. I figured you'd disappeared, but would come back.
that's the one good thing about you barristers. You all know how to talk, John. Yet to meet one who hasn't, but that doesn't. But no, I really appreciate that. So yeah, but John, you know, to expand on the point, then. So we've seen this last couple of weeks, this kind of well, the violence that happened in Bristol. We've seen some of the thuggery against the protesters at lockdown. We've seen the contradictions concerning the Sir Everard vigils as such. And it does make me, I mean, do you think, are the politicians really the people that we should hold culpable for, you know, do you think they're the people that ultimately are directing the police, or do you think the police themselves and some chief constables are just doing their own thing?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, I have been, you know, over the last 10 minutes or so, I have been quite critical of various police officers for the partisan way in which they've decided to police some protests more heavily than others.
Yeah.
But I do think fundamentally responsibility does rest with the lawmakers, those people in Parliament. And I mean, I think particularly with the lockdown issue. I mean, I think, you know, what happened with the Sarah Everard vigil,
Yeah,
was pretty awful. The way the police went in and manhandled the mostly women who were there.
yeah.
But clearly they were actually doing what the law required them to do, you know, protest under the COVID regulations at the moment. I think it's been eased a little bit now, but at the time what they were doing was unlawful, and they'd gone to court, hadn't they, the week before to try and agree terms on which that vigil could take place, and they weren't. And the court said, look, that we don't think that there are terms that will enable this protest to go ahead. So, you know, and then it's a bit rich, isn't it, of politicians to come out, as Priti Patel did, and point the finger at the Met Police, when they have made these very same laws which the Met Police were enforcing. So, yes, I think fundamentally we've always got to point the finger at those who are most responsible, whilst also recognising that the police always have an element of discretion as to how they apply those laws. So that's why I wouldn't let either of them off the hook.
No, John, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that for a lot of the ordinary bobbies on the beat and those who are having to sometimes deal with these difficult enough, contentious demonstrations, that to see Priti Patel and actually another one, our London Mayor himself, Sadiq, he was quite quick to hang the police as well on this one. And yet, as you rightly observed, John, they were ultimately only doing, to a large degree, that which the political class had told them to do. And then when the media suddenly turn around and start bitching about it, all of a sudden, you know, like Pontius Pilate, or like Pontius Pilate, they wash their hands off the you know, the actions of the police. So I felt a bit sorry for the police, slightly sorry for the police. And I certainly agree with you, John. I think responsibility lies with government. Let's be clear. It's a government that has, and Priti Patel, who has been an absolute, I don't know what had you high hopes of her? Because I did, and I have no hopes of her now.
I'm afraid I've never had high hopes for any of the mainstream politicians, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I've never voted Tory. I once voted Labour. That was in 1983, and since then I haven't voted for any mainstream party, because I don't actually think there is much difference between them. I mean, I think you see it very clearly, don't you, with migration. You know, the Tories always talk tough on immigration. Let's get net migration down to 10,000 a year, and they have never been serious about it. And you know, the net figures, what was it last year? It was over 300,000, and moreover, and moreover, you look at the daily incursions onto British soil down at Dover in the south coast. And we just know that the government is not doing anything about it, and all these people, I think it's been, what is it, about 10,000 last year, very few of them even get returned to what is clearly a safe country, namely France, where they've come from. So, you know, I'm not disappointed in any Tory politician, because I've never had expectations in them.
Yeah, well, that's a very pragmatic philosophy. If you don't have any expectations, you can never be disappointed. But you know, but on the subject of police action, I say it of policing. I say somebody mentioned it in the stream here. There was an informal beach picnic here in Northern Ireland on Saturday, on one of our very nice sandy beaches, and I was there, socially distancing, of course, and there were police there. So it was basically it was a part of a World Freedom Day demonstration in favour of restoring our freedoms and removing some, John, of the tyrannies that the political class have imposed on us all over the past year in the name of COVID. You know, but it was interesting. I was watching that there were police in attendance, but they were very well behaved. The police were. The crowd was very well behaved. And maybe the fact there was a beach and, you know, there was ice cream vans and stuff. It wasn't really, you know, the front line as such. But I just thought, I watched the police, you know, and they, I thought to myself, well, you know, really, is there nothing better you could be doing? Like, tell me, John, is there no crime in the UK now? Has all crime gone away? And it's just really about making sure people are adhering to COVID regs? I mean, you know, yeah, a barrister should be able to comment on this. What say you?
Well, I mean, you know, I hear from, I never actually practiced in crime, but I mean, you just hear from people, don't you, about, you know, they've had burglaries or they've been robbed on the streets.
Yeah.
And invariably they find the police are not interested. And, you know, that certainly chimes with people's experience. And, you know, when they're not enforcing the COVID restrictions, they seem to be spending a lot of time policing what we say. On social media in particular. I mean, I agree with you, David. It's almost like that they don't think that real crime happens, but we all know it does. And I think a lot of people have even given up on reporting crimes to the police now because they know that the police are not interested. Well, one other point I would make about this as well is I don't think the problem here is just with the police. I actually think a lot of our sentencing is, well, actually there's different stages, aren't there? First of all, the police tend not to pursue a lot of crimes.
Yes.
Then they do, the CPS often drop them, and then if they do actually proceed to court and they get a conviction, I think some of the sentences handed out are just ridiculously low, and I think there's a serious problem there. And I would say it's because one of the central objectives of sentencing, as enshrined in law, is rehabilitation, and it shouldn't be. It should be punishment.
Great.
Because if you make rehabilitation as a central objective of sentencing, then that enables, for example, the offender to say, oh, don't send me to prison, I'll lose my job, and hence I'll lose the stability I have in society. And of course, that's what nearly every offender says. And judges, I'm afraid, invariably buy it. So you often see reported, more often than not, in the Daily Mail. I'm afraid a lot of other newspapers tend not to cover these issues. But you do often see how people have been given ridiculously light sentences because the judge will say things like, I don't want you to lose the stability you have in society. Well, I'm sorry, if you commit a crime, then you need to be punished. And it may well be that rehabilitation is a beneficial side effect of that punishment, because when you're punished, you have time to reflect on what you've done, and you may well then come out as a better person.
Well, John, I completely agree with you. For years, I've argued that, for example, the central purpose of prisons are places for punishment. I have argued that I think prisons should be made such severe places that you never ever want to go back, John. You know, so if you commit a crime, a custodial crime that gets you a custodial sentence rather, and you end up behind bars, it should be so tough that you sure as heck never want to go back. But we've made our prisons, you know, they may not be nice places, but they're not horrible places. And I think, you know, again, this whole kind of, we've got to rehabilitate, which is like creeping liberalism. But I think it's manifest across the whole well, actually the policing and the judicial system from top to bottom.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100% there, David. And what I would add is that I think that the human rights laws has done a huge amount to undermine prison discipline. You might remember a few years ago, there was the so-called book ban that was challenged in the courts. Well, it wasn't really a book ban because prisoners were quite able to borrow from their own prison libraries. They could get whatever books they wanted. The reason why the government wanted to stop people bringing in books is because books were being used to smuggle in drugs. But you know, our laws are such, and our judiciary is such that perfectly reasonable measure taken by the minister was declared unlawful. And you know, the human rights laws have done so much to damage the ability of prisons to actually punish people by celebrating or elevating the rights, so-called, of prisoners. I mean, we know from the celebrated case of prisoners having the right to vote, which now a tiny number of them do. But I mean, it's not the tiny number that matters. What matters is the fact that human rights laws actually couldn't see that there was nothing wrong with not just depriving a prisoner of his liberty, but also as a consequence of that, depriving him of the right to vote. And that's just illustrative of the sorts of problems that that the government has had to deal with. And you know, consequently, and this I do know about because I used to do a lot of civil cases that involve people who came out of prison. They would invariably have easy and ready access to drugs in prison. And the problems caused by that, and not just the addictions that causes, but of course you get arguments and you get trading about all the drugs in prisons. I mean, it's just madness that the government can't see the problem and start addressing it, but it won't.
But I mean, I suppose it's going over the same point. But I suppose some people would have thought that, well, with a conservative government, we will get a greater grip on our, on prisons and making sure that criminals are punished. But as we've agreed, John, that's a complete and utter illusion. I feel, I don't know about you, but I think that after all these years now of conservative rule, prisons are getting softer and softer, and to the point we actually think, well, what's the point? What's the bloody point in sending someone to prison if at the end of the day they've got no fear of going back? They are not. The rehabilitation is a joke as well. So I mean, what is the point of it?
Well, I agree, David. And look, let's face it. I mean, the Tories have been in power now for 11 years, haven't they? First 5 years with the Lib Dems, but 11 years in total, and the last 6 years without any encumbrance. So, you know, they've had plenty of time to reshape the law. But a point I often raise on Twitter is, when did you last hear a government minister or spokesman talk about toughening up on law and order? I mean, I can't think of when it last happened. I mean, they keep engaging in all these stunts, by which I mean passing new laws that will ensure that people can go to prison for longer. You know, so it's almost like they want to show or say to the public that we are tough on crime because we're passing ever longer sentences. But it's all pointless, because if you don't, first of all, catch the criminals, and if you don't then have them sentenced properly, because the full length of sentence is hardly ever used, and then if you don't have a proper penal system when the prisoner is in prison, it's all pointless. And so much of what this government does, it seems to me, is pointless, because it's all grandstanding. It's about trying to say we are doing things that are effective, but in reality, nothing changes.
No, you're right. You know, a final word just on this topic. I kind of think, John, that one of the ways you can measure a free society is in the ability that people have to peacefully protest, to peacefully register that they're unhappy about this, that, and the other, whatever it is, be it from the right, left, don't care. But that's the measure of a free society. You have to say, John, by almost any objective measure, we increasingly don't live in that kind of society.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think the right to protest peacefully is an essential part of a democracy. And what is it? It's a year tomorrow, I think, since the first coronavirus laws were imposed. So basically, since the lockdown was imposed. And for the best part of a year now, we have been under different forms of house arrest, haven't we? There's really no other way to describe it. You know, if you can only leave your house if you have a reasonable excuse, and if as we know, the police have very often been stopping people, and they've even been fined and prosecuted for being out of doors, mixing with others, and doing things which under the laws they're not supposed to do. Then that doesn't speak well, does it, for our democracy? And you know, I think that really is quite chilling. The only sort of rider I would mention to that, though, David, is, and I suppose, you know, we're perhaps thinking about this now because of the police and crime bill that's going through Parliament. Is that I do think there may be one or two issues where the government does need to amend the law to deal with public order matters. I'm thinking particularly again of the Extinction Rebellion protests. And I have in mind here the fact that there was a legal case just over a year ago when the Met Police did stop the Extinction Rebellion protests from happening, and they imposed a London-wide ban. Which they can do, or at least they thought they could do, under the Public Order Act. But then a couple of weeks later, that went to court, and it was declared unlawful on the grounds that because of the disparate nature of all these different protests, you couldn't impose a London-wide prohibition. So, you know, when you have problems like that thrown up, then I think, you know, there's certainly a need to address that issue with possibly new laws. But again, you know, the government, which is passing through the police and crime bill, which has very, very sweeping measures that can be used to curtail demonstrations, and it hasn't explained the justifications for any of them, it seems to be. And I suspect that's because in a lot of respects the justifications aren't there. But even where they are there, and this again comes back to what I was saying earlier about the Tory party, that they seem to be unable to articulate any reasonable argument for change. It's almost as if they are afraid of themselves and their own argument.